Did you know that being a doctor used to be embarrassing? Today, it's a six-figure career with massive prestige. But go back in time, and picking up a scalpel made you a tradesman on par with a guy who fixes clogged toilets, except your clogs were gangrenous toes and your office smelled like a slaughterhouse. Today, we're going back to find the worst time in history to have called yourself a doctor. In medieval Europe, doctor wasn't one job. It was a three-tier hierarchy, and no matter where you sat on the ladder, the job was a daily struggle between your dignity and your gag reflex. At the top was the physician. He was an academic who studied the stars and refused to touch gross patients. Instead, he did something arguably more gross. He diagnosed you by looking at, smelling, and tasting your urine like it was a fine wine. And if that didn't work and a local lord died, he would lose his head. He lived in constant fear of being found out as a fraud who drank pee for a living. Below him was the surgeon, a tradesman on par with the guys who made shoes or tanned leather. He was essentially a mechanic for humans. And because he actually did the dirty work, like pulling teeth or setting bones, he was considered socially unclean. He was the guy who actually saved lives, but he wasn't allowed at the same table as the physicians because he constantly smelled like a slaughterhouse. At the very bottom was the barber surgeon. This was the ultimate medieval side hustle. He trimmed beards in the morning and cut out gallstones in the afternoon. Those red and white poles you see outside barbershops today come from that era when doctors were legally hairstylists. White is for the bandages. Red is for the blood of the guy who didn't survive the haircut. By the 1700s, medicine had real schools, textbooks, and theory. The problem was, the theory was completely wrong. Welcome to what was called heroic medicine, where the solution to every sickness was a violent assault on the patient. If you didn't bleed, poison, or burn your patient, you were considered a coward. One state-of-the-art treatment was to place leeches on a patient's eye, tongue, or other sensitive areas. Part of the doctor's job was to maintain a literal farm of blood-sucking worms. If that wasn't fast enough, you used the scarificator, a brass box with a dozen spring-loaded blades that made 12 simultaneous cuts. This is how they treated George Washington. In 1799, he woke up with a simple throat infection. So his doctors removed 40% of his blood in 12 hours. He was dead by nightfall. When they weren't draining blood, they were prescribing mercury for everything: syphilis, constipation, depression, fevers. When the patient's teeth fell out and their gums began to rot, doctors saw it as signs the treatment was working. If that wasn't enough, they did blistering, which meant creating massive, painful chemical burns on the skin to draw out toxins. If the patient was screaming and covered in pus-filled bubbles, the doctor patted himself on the back. Success! And if the front didn't work, the doctors attacked from the rear, literally pumping vinegar or oil or tobacco smoke up the patient's butt. There were actual tobacco resuscitation kits kept along the River Thames to help drowning victims with a very confused version of CPR. By the 1840s, the doctor had climbed. He had a proper education, a proper title, and a professional association. They started doubting the violent, heroic medicine approach, but they didn't have anything to replace it with. They were basically doing heroic medicine light while trying to be more scientific. This should have been progress, but it actually made things more humiliating for them, because they were being consistently outperformed by guys in top hats selling patent medicine from the back of a wagon on a street corner. The patent medicines were mostly alcohol, opium, and hope. They didn't cure anything, but they didn't harm anything either. Doctors were still doing watered-down versions of harmful treatments, while salesmen accidentally did less harm and let the body heal itself. It didn't help that doctors were now working in hospitals. In the 1840s, a hospital was a house of death, a place you went only when you had no other options. Doctors were congregating the sickest people in the city into unwashed, crowded wards. If you stayed home and drank a con artist's flavored gin, your body had a fighting chance. If you went to a scientific hospital, you were entering a biological crossfire of every disease in the neighborhood. Surgeons wore dark, formal tailcoats that they never washed. A blood-crusted coat was a badge of honor, proof that you were busy, experienced, and successful. A doctor would spend his morning elbow deep in a rotting corpse for an autopsy, then head straight to the maternity ward to deliver a baby with those same corpse juice hands. A Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis finally figured out what was happening. When he started implementing hand washing, mortality rates in his maternity ward dropped from 10% to 1% instantly. But when he tried to tell the medical establishment, they were offended. Since doctors were considered gentlemen, they couldn't possibly be dirty. Semmelweis was mocked, fired, and eventually committed to an asylum where he was beaten by guards and died from, ironically, an infection. So what finally changed? Why did the medical world suddenly stop being a death cult? In 1861, Louis Pasteur published Germ Theory, and doctors were forced to face a horrific reality. They weren't the heroes. They were the vectors. The blood-blackened coat was traded for a crisp white one to broadcast a message. We are clean. We are scientific. We are not the people who just spent decades accidentally killing you. Please come back. Then came proper licensing. Then germ theory in the textbooks. Then hospitals that people actually survived. The most trusted profession in the world spent most of its history being wrong, broke, and embarrassing. It's a miracle anyone stuck with it, but against all odds, the career from hell finally became a science. Thanks for watching. Now go wash your hands and hit subscribe for another era that'll make you glad you live in the future.